You might have seen Alex Belfield pop up in the news again in yet another libel case filed against him, this time by a police officer who was handling the case against him. The news articles say that he's to pay a substantial settlement to the officer, which I'll come back to in a moment, and at least one of those articles has said that he's been ordered to pay this amount and that the police officer has won the case against him. Now, all of this is open to a little bit of interpretation and is a little bit subjective, because what does substantial mean and what does it mean to have won a case as opposed to settle it? And why is it that some of these news agencies are not being absolutely specific and accurate with figures as they are in some other news stories, all of which I hope to demystify for you in this video. But first of all, if you are new to me, I'm Daniel Shensmith, a barrister of England and Wales, and I enjoy helping you to understand law even if I can hardly talk properly because I've got an upper respiratory tract infection. But I fight the fight, and here we go. So let's take a look at some of these terms and see what we really think about them. Well, let's look at what the news companies are referring to by way of the settlement in the first instance. They each describe it as a substantial settlement. But what does that really mean? Because substantial to one person may not be substantial to another. Let's take Elon Musk, for example. £100,000 is probably not substantial to Elon Musk in the day-to-day operation of his business. As I recall him saying at one point, it's all relative to their own individual scale. So each person have their own relative scale as to what they consider a substantial amount of money. And so a substantial settlement for one person may not well be that for another. Somebody going to court or being taken to court for, let's say, £1,000 might consider that substantial because that is a chunk of money that if you were handed it today and it was unexpected money, you might think that's quite substantial. As opposed to £10,000, £50,000 or £100,000 or more. And indeed, the costs for this might also be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. In libel cases, it's very normal for these costs to be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it is also normal that not all of those costs are either paid by way of a settlement or ordered by a court in the event that they win. But that brings us to the specifics of this situation, because none of the news companies are reporting specific figures here. And there's a very important reason for that, and that is that this case has been settled. Contrary to what at least one of the articles said, the case hasn't been won in the strictest of sense, and he hasn't been ordered to pay in the strictest of sense. But there is a little bit of truth to that, which I'll hope to explain. You see, once a case is live, once it's been issued by the court and there is a live claim number, then that is an ongoing litigation. The court will make orders and directions, and the case must wind its way forward until ultimately it gets to trial, which is the most expensive part of the litigation. But at any point, even before proceedings are issued and all the way up until trial, each side can make offers and can accept offers to settle the claim and all of the claim, and in doing so will invariably include as part of the order, which we refer to as a consent order, to bring the proceedings to a stop, a stay as we call it. So proceedings are stayed, as in on pause, provided that the parties comply with the terms of this agreement, and if one party fails to comply with the terms of that agreement, then the other party can sue for essentially a breach of contract, breach of the terms that are set out within the schedule of that termination agreement. And this is the very reason that the news companies are not really reporting on any of the specifics of this settlement, because it's confidential. Because not always, but almost always, these are confidential schedules attached to what we call a Tomlin order. A Tomlin order is an order that is drawn up with consent of the parties. It goes back and forth quite a lot before the parties agree to the contents of the Tomlin order and how it's drafted, and it is usually drafted in a very particular and meticulous wording before it's accepted by both parties, and then ultimately the court has the final say. The court won't very often interfere with the wording of a Tomlin order and the schedule within it, but the court can refuse to accept it if there's a specific wording the court doesn't like. But very broadly speaking, the court is going to accept that as a form of consent order between the parties, but in a formal order to bring the proceedings to a standstill, provided that the parties comply with the terms drawn up within the schedule. Else, one party may go back to court to enforce the terms of that agreement. But this is the very reason that these news companies are not reporting on the specifics, because it will be within the confidential schedule attached to the Tomlin Order. So even if I had sight of the Tomlin Order and the confidential schedule, and even if any of the other media companies had sight of the Tomlin Order and the confidential schedule, they wouldn't be allowed to disclose it to you because it will be confidential between those parties. And that is ultimately why it is in the news, but in a sort of vague format. And so, as I said, a substantial settlement to one person may not be substantial to another, so there is a degree of subjectivity as to how you understand what the agreement is. And ultimately, you will never know unless both parties agree to make that public, which is highly unlikely. And so you might then contrast that with, why is it that I am able to read out other judgments, such as the judgment with Tommy Robinson, where the case against him was dismissed as no case to answer? Well, that is quite straightforward. That is because that was a written reasoning of the judge, and even expressly said that the media, the public, and essentially everybody has the right to know and understand what the reasoning behind that decision was. And that is why I read out parts of it to you and I explained parts of it to you, because that is essentially a public document. It is a public decision of the court, and in its written form, it is accessible and available to the public. Whereas the Tomlin Order, as between Alex Belfield and the police officer, is ultimately confidential. Well, at the very least, the schedule is confidential. In theory, any person could approach the court to get a copy of the Tomlin Order, but it wouldn't include the confidential schedule when they send it to you, because that is obviously confidential. So if you've seen this in the news and you're wondering why there are no specific figures, that would be the reason why. I hope that's of some assistance to you. Please do bop that like button and subscribe for putting up with my croaky voice. And as always, thank you for watching.